Hello, welcome everyone. This is the second session of our Nature of Prosperity dialogue, which is co-hosted this event between CUSP, the Centre for the Understanding of Sustainable Prosperity, and the Foundation for Democracy and Sustainable Development. And those of you who had the chance to catch the discussion this morning around the idea of protecting the interests of future generations will have heard a wonderfully rich conversation from a fantastic panel of people, which we will later put up on the website as an archive for people to view again. And we would encourage you very much to visit that when you have a chance to do so. But this afternoon's session is something slightly different. It's a celebration of an idea that two colleagues of mine within CUSP had probably 18 months, almost 2 years ago, it could be now, to bring the arts more into our discussions about the nature of prosperity. And in particular, we had the idea to launch a call for nature writing essays from unpublished authors. And I'm just going to turn very quickly to Ian to say a little bit about the genesis of that idea. Ian.
Well, thanks very much, Tim. And first, before I go any further, congratulations to Mahima and Orlaith and all the new authors who are in the collection that we launched today, Nature Writing for a Common Good. And they're taking their place in really striking cultural development over the last 10, 20 years, which we did a study on within CUSP. With this surge in nature writing, you can't move for shelves and walls full of nature writing books in the bookshops now. And this is a wave of work which is comparable to the last big wave of nature writing in the 1930s and 40s. And there's something in common between them, because many people at that time and now are writing in response to an existential threat, a countryside, to nature overall, from urban development, technology, loss of wildlife and landscapes and so on. And as then, and as in much of the earlier romantic writing on nature, around the time of the Industrial Revolution, the wave we've got going on now is about mourning and taking stock of what's being lost, what's left, what we're afraid we're about to lose next. And it's about a discipline of paying really hard, close attention to the immediacy, the particularity of your encounter with a landscape or with a creature as a process of reconnection with more than human worlds. And I think what's new this time is that we've now got much greater awareness of global to local scales of threat, climate crisis, biodiversity crisis. And that means there's a strand in the new nature writing of mourning, preemptive grief, we might call it, that's very intense. And this has generated some amazing work. And Kate and I are big fans of the new nature writing wave. People like Robert Macfarlane at Cambridge, who's been an instigator and rediscoverer of a lot of fine earlier work, like Nan Shepherd's book, The Living Mountain, J.A. Baker's book, The Peregrine, others like Kathleen Jamie, Tim Dee, Helen MacDonald, Mark Cocker. They've produced incredibly impressive work, which has inspired large numbers of people. And all that said, and as I say, Kate and I are fans of many writers and books in this new wave of nature writing. We felt some unease about the way that the genre has been developing. And there's a hope in the new nature writing that it's sometimes explicit, sometimes unspoken, is that it can do really valuable work in what Rowan this morning in discussion called the interplay between the very particular and the large scale, the big crises and challenges bound up in the question of sustainability and unsustainability. And Kate and I wanted to ask the question, is new nature writing living up to that potential? So we did a short piece of research in CUSP on this. We wrote a journal paper, you can find a link to that on the website, highlighting what we saw as some weaknesses and risks in the whole project of what's been emerging as new nature writing over the last 10, 20 years. And that analysis led us to the idea of a CUSP new nature writing contest. And I'll hand over to Kate to summarize our analysis.
Thanks very much, Ian, and thanks, Tim, and thanks to all the authors who took part in our competition, rather delayed as it was by COVID and other world events. Yes, so Ian and I, as Ian says, are big fans of this work, but we did notice some problems with it, and these are not necessarily, original observations that have been made before, in a sense. But one of the issues around new nature writing is that there does tend to be a certain narrowness of voices. It's often quite male, and there is a tendency to sort of celebrate grand endeavours in the outdoors, which always makes one wonder who's doing the kind of washing up or whatever back at home. So there's an element of that. There's an element in which the account is often very individualistic, which is totally understandable. Many of us go into nature to be on our own or with a small group of people, but it takes it away from somewhat from ideas of the collective in some senses, and is often about the individual experience, and also somewhat about nature as kind of consolation, sometimes even personal consolation at times of kind of loss or at times of personal distress. And again, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, but it's a rather a limitation on what we were trying to think of as what's the more political, maybe more social role of new nature writing. And although there are many really good examples, and increasingly, I think, of people drawing attention to, what accounts for the state of our countryside. So people will often wander around in new nature writing books and talk about the loss of animals or the privatization of land or the denuded nature that we live in. But we didn't feel there was quite enough attention to, why things were the way they were. I mean, we haven't always lived in a denuded nature. We haven't always had the problems of biodiversity that we have. So we kind of wondered whether there was any role for new nature writing to take on slightly more some of the questions about, why things are the way they are. What might be collective experiences of nature, and what might we collectively do to address some of those problems, rather than just see it as a kind of consolation for a loss that we almost find unbearable, as Ian said. So I think we hit on a kind of either we started a vein of good writing in this area, but more modestly, I suspect we kind of went with a vein of thinking in this area, which is, and we have seen in the months since and a couple of years, I suppose, since we published our article, we have seen quite a lot of focus on getting a more diverse range of voices into new nature writing. So Catherine Norbury's doing a collection of women writers at the moment. We see competitions for young writers. I think Robert McFarlane was behind one of those. We see focuses on particular communities who maybe haven't had quite as much of a say in new nature writing. And we wanted to do something that was very much about bringing in a wider range of voices, so hence the focus on unpublished writers that we had, but also maybe addressing some of these questions about new nature writing for the common good. So beyond individual consolation, what can this kind of understanding, this very rich understanding that nature writing brings us, what can it do in terms of collective questions about how we might address some of these issues?
Thanks, Kate. Just reflecting on the contributions that we had. I mean, one of the points that you raised there was the sort of question of diversity, and potentially a lack of diversity in the nature writing and new nature writing in particular. And the phrase that comes to mind is Kathleen Jamie's lone enraptured male in a London Review of Books article. What were you surprised by the response that we had to the competition?
No, I don't think I was. I mean, we saw a lot of women writers. We saw a lot of unpublished writers. We had a lot of people who from different kind of communities. But I do think there's it's quite difficult in a sense. The competitions for unpublished writers are always quite difficult, because if you haven't ever published before, the barrier is quite high. So I think you might expect a sudden flood of incredibly, different sort of voices, but you realise that there are lots of barriers, internal, psychological, economic, all sorts, cultural, all sorts of other barriers why people maybe haven't published before, or particular groups haven't published before. So the response that you get is never is much more diverse, but maybe not as quite as much as you might think it would be. You can't. I suppose what I'm saying is you can't just say I'd like some unpublished writers and expect that group of people to be very, very different from people who already are writers.
Sure. Yeah. Ian.
I'm not particularly surprised. And I think there are lots of really great women role models, as it were, exemplars and sources of inspiration. We've mentioned Kathleen Jamie, we've mentioned Catherine Norbury. There are examples on our distinguished panel of judges as well. So I'm not particularly surprised about that. I think that there's another dimension to the lack of diversity, which is now being addressed, and that's about diversity of content as well as of voice. So there is a need, I think, for a greater focus on places which have not been covered so much in new nature writing, in thinking about landscapes and so on, looking more closely at the edgelands between cities and countryside, nature in the suburbs, nature in city centres, the places, as we say in our afterword, of outstanding natural neglect as well as outstanding natural beauty. So we need to hear, I think, a diversity of places as well as a diversity of voices. But I'm really encouraged by what we've seen in the response to the entry to the contest.
Thanks, Ian. Ian, you mentioned the exemplars on our distinguished panel of judges, and our panel today to discuss the nature writing essays. And I'll come to those in a little while. But I thought we should start with an exemplar, an extract from one of the essays that was contributed to the call, and Orla has very, very kindly agreed to do this. And I think, given what Kate and Ian have just said, and given the kind of hugely demanding nature of presenting under the circumstances that we're presenting under today, I'm really grateful that Orla has, and Mahima, who will talk to us later, has agreed to read something of her own work. So one of hers was one of the essays submitted to the competition, and just to hear a little bit of the flavour of the kinds of entries that we had. And this one in particular, of course, speaks very much to the edges that Ian was talking about just a moment ago. So I'm just going to ask Orla to take a deep breath and relax and have a laugh and read us a little bit from your essay, which was entitled "Ignorance and Bliss."
Yes, thanks very much, Tim, and thanks to all the panel. So I'll begin my first time reading my own writing out loud like this. I used to think I was pretty outdoorsy. I like hiking, I swim in the sea, I work for an environmental charity, but these phony credentials can carry me no further. My secret eco-shame is that I don't know very much about nature. I lived in Glasgow, Dublin, Paris, and London, but never in the countryside. Worthy tomes by Robert Macfarlane and John Muir stare out at me from every bookshop, books that I know I should, but never will read. Friends and colleagues compare notes on the best pen knives and bivy bags, while I stare into the distance, a single tear rolling down my cheek, and admit that I've never been camping outside of a festival. In Dublin, where I grew up, you could get away with such omissions. As soon as you inched the nose of your bike outside the front door, you were heralded as a young Dervla Murphy. In school, we were periodically tested on our knowledge of the natural world, with less than impressive results. Our geography teacher made us gather 3 points of geographical interest over each summer break and present them to the class on the first day back. We all thought one girl had it made when she recounted her visit to the pineapple plantations in Hawaii, but she crumbled under pressure. When quizzed on how these plants actually grow, she panicked and said, "In bushels?" a phrase that would haunt her for the rest of her school years. On another occasion, we were asked to name the largest dam in the world, and a classmate shot up her hand with, "I could be wrong, but is it Notre Dame?" Later educational encounters with the natural world were not much better. Studying modern European history at university, I learned about the Enlightenment and the establishment of royal societies and botanic gardens across Europe. We read about wealthy male botanist after wealthy male botanist, but their relentless pursuit of classification to put everything in its proper box seemed to me just another example of man's foolish attempt to tame and ultimately dominate nature. What's more, this was one of the few aspects of the Enlightenment in which we could have delved deep into the contribution of women, but sadly we never heard a peep. Between the man-made climate crisis and the queues to reach the summit of Everest, it seems that little has changed. Our relationship with nature has been described as a tragic love story, and in this relationship we are hapless at best and abusive at worst. Almost every time we interact with nature, we deplete it. We stomp over peat bogs and sand dunes, raid beaches for the prettiest shells, and storm through spiders' webs. We don high-tech gear to brave the mountains, and when we get home, refreshed and ruddy-faced, we wash the kit and flush microplastic fibres into the babbling brooks over which we just leapt. On Winchelsea Beach last summer, I turned over a stone to find a saccharine message scrawled by a little girl in pink marker. Dreams are like stars. You may never touch them, but if you follow them, they will lead you to where you need to go. Well, Bethan, the leachate from that permanent marker has probably destroyed the local marine ecosystem. How's that for a dream? But in a way, these stories calm my nerves. I can see that I'm not alone in my profound ignorance of the natural world. When I lived in London, I thought I could hide my shame by choosing a home in a deeply urban, sometimes ugly estate in East London, where the only babbling brooks were of bin fluid and stale beer. The wind regularly whipped up little vortexes of plastic bags, weed smoke, and cigarette butts and blew them across the grey plains of Tower Hamlets. An unlikely place, you might think, for communion with nature. Enter my housemates who coaxed every possible ounce of growth out of the area. On our front porch, there were potatoes, purple sprouting broccoli, chard spinach, rocket tomatoes, and broad beans growing in big planters. And if it seems I'm bragging about the fruits of my gardening efforts, please be assured I had nothing to do with it. In summer, that area began to bloom, and the front porch became a hive of local activity. An old man passed every morning to get his copy of The Sun in the corner shop. On his way back, he would stop to inspect the plants and peer through the big kitchen window to see if anyone was in. We were, and we smiled and waved. He never smiled back. By contrast, the Bangladeshi woman 2 doors down would spend her afternoons gazing lovingly at the growth. If the door was open, she would wander in to give us unsolicited gardening advice. She didn't speak much English, but we took very good and very nice as confirmation that we were on the right track. Left to my own devices, I feel I never would have made these neighborhood or natural connections. As a lifelong urbanite, my default setting is head down, earphones in, and focus on myself. And this individualism can make learning about the natural world a chore. It's very daunting to tackle the canon of nature writing on my own with its hundreds of literary references that I can't make out and millions of species that I can't name. The quicker route I have found is to surround yourself with friendly, non-judgmental people who can provide you with an introduction. The women I lived with in London are wonderful, open people who put as much effort into meeting the neighbours as they do tending the garden. They helped me to begin separating the green from the grey and wake up to the nature peeping through the cracks in the urban landscape. So given the scale of the crisis facing our natural world and the profundity of my and others' ignorance, new nature writing must aim to reach and inspire as many people as possible. To put it in millennial-friendly gym parlance, how can we take nature writing, zhuzh it in a NutriBullet and supercharge it for maximum results? It would be prudent for authors to consider 3 guiding principles. Firstly, where and how does the majority of the world's population live? The world is and will be increasingly urban, multi-ethnic, and unless we see radical change in our social and economic systems, deeply unequal. People relate to what they see around them, and for most of us today, that means diverse cities made up of the excessively rich, the unacceptably poor, and everyone in between. To inspire and instill a love of the natural world in future generations, nature writing must reach all members of this society. Second, simplicity. Even as I type this, Microsoft Word has been correcting what I thought were hauntingly beautiful literary turns of phrase. Consider using concise language, it says. Harsh, but if the algorithm dictates it, it must be so. And that means that nature writers will have to gradually wean themselves off compound adjectives. No more wind buffeted, no more rain soaked, no more sun yellowed. And finally, we must recognize that not every encounter with nature will be profound or healing. If we expect a spiritual awakening every time, we'll probably be disappointed. Weeding the garden, trudging through the rain, an Instagram post that didn't get as many likes as you expected, each of these is soul crushing in its own way. As Zoe Gilbert wrote recently in The Guardian, enchantment is not everywhere all the time. Or, as I like to put it, sometimes nature is crap.
Orlaith, thank you for that. Applause is one of those things that's really, really difficult to do in a Zoom webinar, but very much to you, not just to your writing, but to your reading and to the courage of reading your own writing on a Zoom webinar. So thank you very much for that. Let me bring in our panelists now. So we have Jessica, that's great, thanks Jessica, Louisa and Madeleine, and Mahima, let me ask you also to put your video on as well and join the discussion. Let me tell you a little bit about they are incredibly esteemed, in fact. So Jessica Lee is a British Canadian Taiwanese author and environmental historian. She's won all sorts of prizes, most recently the 2019 RBC Taylor Prize for, I think it was a promising newcomer or something along those lines, Jessica, wasn't it? And is shortlisted, very excitingly, for the Hilary Weston Prize, which is going to be announced tomorrow, which is a very, very, very exciting to have been shortlisted for that. And that was for a book called Two Trees Make a Forest, which is Jessica's second book. And so Jessica actually really comes to us with a quite a recent knowledge of what it means to become a writer, which I'll come back to in just a moment. Louisa Adjoa Parker is a writer and diversity consultant. Her heritage is English and Ghanaian. She writes poetry, fiction, Black, Asian and minority ethnic history, and explores diversity and inclusion. In fact, she set up something called the Inclusion Agency, and this question of inclusion and diversity is very, very key to her heart. And her most recent book is a book called How to Wear a Skin, which maybe, Louisa, you can tell us a little bit about in a moment. And she's also set up a fantastic community project, which is called Where Are You Really From?, which is encouraging people to write about their origins and their roots and the way that they experience those roots. And Madeleine Bunting, Madeleine, it's great to have you here again. Madeleine actually has a long history with our work in CUSP and in the predecessors of CUSP. And I don't know if you remember this, Madeleine, that you spoke at our opening event in 2006 for one of the predecessors of CUSP called Resolve, and has been a kind of friend of our work, looking at sustainable prosperity for quite a while. She is a award-winning writer, former Guardian columnist, and her latest work actually is a novel, so it'd be kind of interesting to reflect a little bit on the difference between novel fiction writing and non-fiction writing. But previous books include in particular Love of Country, which was a book about her own visits to the Hebrides. Mahima is going to read to us a little bit later, but I will say a little bit about her work at the moment. She works with global companies to reimagine business models. She describes herself as a nature lover and a futurist, and is an advisor to BirdLife International. She also mentors social impact startups in the social enterprise sector. So both of our contributing writers actually, interestingly, come at it from within sustainability. But the question I'd kind of like to start with, and maybe I could start with you, Jessica, is a much more simple and perhaps a more personal one. What is it that makes us want to write about nature?
I think this will be a bit different for everybody, and everyone will probably come at this from a very different angle. From my perspective, at least, so much of it has been tied to this issue of connection with the more than human world, you might say. Not just because, I think, and sort of this has already been pointed to, it helps me to think a lot about myself in a very individualistic way. There is that component, but in that sort of visceral, I guess, replication on the page of the experience of being out in the landscape, there's a real opportunity to attend to everything that's going on beyond us, right? So when I'm able to come back, say, from a hike and say, oh, I'm going to work on this and put this in a book, there is that moment of reconstructing for myself a much wider sense of community on the page. And that could be, you know, from rocks to trees to birds to, I'm quite interested in moss and algae and tiny things, right? So it really does allow you to attend to the world, I think, much more, it sounds silly, attentively, and with warmth and with, I think, you know, that real sense of intimacy that I think is the bridge to care.
Fantastic, thanks, Jessica. Let me ask Louisa the same question. What motivates your writing about nature?
Hi, yeah, it's a really good question. So similar to Jessica, really, it's about that sort of connection. And I think for me, sort of being in nature has always felt very grounding. So obviously, you know, if you're having a difficult time and you go into those spaces, you can reflect on your place in the world, really, and humans' place in the world. And when you're in these kind of vast historical places, you can sort of, you know, realize that we're just specks, you know, we're just very small specks, and our lives will be passed in an instant. And it just helps you sort of put everything in perspective. And I think that I'm really fascinated with the relationship between humans and nature, because in the UK, there's not really many places that exist, you know, in nature that haven't really been impacted by humans. You know, in some places of the world, they do still exist, but I think here that's really, really rare. And I think it's just that kind of that fascination with place and how place shapes us and how we shape the places we live in. And I think also for me, it's a beautiful backdrop to tell stories. And I'm really fascinated in the stories which are set in rural places and also stories by water. If I see a drama that's set by the sea, I'll automatically go, oh yeah, I want to watch that. I want to hear about the lives of the people living next to the sea and what their lives are like. So yeah, lots of reasons. It's just inspiring and grounding.
Fantastic, thanks Louisa. I want to come back to that idea of that kind of the way in which the writing as an activity connects us with our natural environment, just to sort of hold that thought a little bit. But Madeleine, I mean, you've written as a journalist, as a novelist, and a little bit as a nature writer about place. What motivates your writing?
Yeah, just to say, Tim, that I published a book last month. So my most recent book actually is about care. So yes, it was. I
saw that was coming. I didn't realize it was out. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Labours, Love, Lost.
Labours of Love, the crisis
Labours
of care.
Love, yeah.
And it picks up beautifully on the point that Jessica just made about intimacy being a bridge into care, because the argument in that book is very much about care within the context of human relationship. But I would argue that you can absolutely apply care in a kind of a context of sort of environmental crisis as well. It's just that within the scope of my book, I wanted to kind of keep that focus on human relationship. So I think that's a sort of lovely sort of side point. But to go back to the question of why I write, I feel like a bit of an interloper, because actually in Kate and Ian's paper in which they sort of critiqued new nature writing, I was one of their kind of guilty people, I think, that they felt that I wasn't that I was making some of the sort of errors that they feel about perhaps not focusing enough on nature. I think I felt, I mean, I've not had a chance to sort of discuss it with them, but I don't see myself really as a nature writer. That's why I feel a bit of an interloper here. My interest is in place, and Louisa raised this point of place. And within the context of place, I'm fascinated with really how human beings find their sense of belonging and grounding in the world. And nature is a huge part of that, which is why my books do end up engaging very, very much with nature. But I would also say relationship is, all kinds of relationships, political and intimate and so forth. So the books I've written, the plot, which is about North Yorkshire, where I grew up, and then my book on the Hebrides, are both looking at a whole set of relationships about how human beings find their home on the surface of the earth, how they create home. And I think that my interest is homemaking and the way in which nature is used, both for material purposes, but also deeply symbolic and therapeutic. I mean, Ian's beautifully insightful and thoughtful introduction talked about a consolation that we find in nature. But I would say that the primary thing is therapeutic, and much of the new nature writing has addressed this issue. And I think that as much as that we have an environmental crisis, and that is undisputed, I think we also have a crisis of kind of human relationship. And that's why nature becomes such an incredibly important place, really, for working through the nature of that crisis. So many of us, I think, at a very profound level, feel uncared for. So there's lots of big subjects, and sorry to sort of wrap them all up in one package, so to speak.
No, that's fantastic. I mean, I think actually it's a really useful contribution to argue that place and relationship are at the core of nature writing, so in a sense. And I'm sure Kate and Ian weren't trying to accuse you of crimes to nature writing. In fact, obviously,
great crime to be accused of.
Not in the least.
Not in the least. Says
I'm in the footnotes. I am in the footnotes, Ian.
Oh, you're going to have to take this up later, outside, off camera. It was. I mean, one of the things that Ian and Kate did draw attention to in their article is the question of diversity and voice, and who has voice. But there's also the question of what kind of voice, and I wanted to touch on that a little bit. It relates a little bit to Orla's point about simplicity and having Microsoft Correct, or whatever word correct package it was, saying you may want to express this more concisely. Is there something to you as writers about the tone of nature writing, and does it distinguish? And this was a little bit the suggestion, perhaps, of both Ian and Kate in their document, but also of Orla in her essay, that there's and certainly of Kathleen Jamie in her characterization of the lone enraptured male. Is there something that is different between the way that different people write about nature, and is there something that you hold dear, some quality that you hold dear in the writing itself? Is it about simplicity? Is it about color? Is it about complexity? Is it about emotion? Jessica, perhaps I could ask you to talk about that.
Yeah, I think this idea of there being no sort of one size fits all solution to what nature writing might be is something that I've been really preoccupied with, particularly as I edit a nature writing journal where we publish work by writers of color exclusively. And one of the things when I designed that project, and as we worked on it over the past few years, has been this idea that we accept nonfiction, we accept fiction, we accept poetry. And sometimes we get video essays, sometimes we get all different formats. And that's really important to attend to, because I think if we're just trying to replicate a sort of romantic era sense of nature writing, or a 1930s, God forbid, version of nature writing, or if we're just looking, say, to Roger Deacon as a mold, or Rob McFarlane, who are brilliant writers in their own right, but not everybody is that person, right? Like, everyone's got a different perspective, and we bring different kinds of expertise to the fore. So it doesn't necessarily mean that we all need to be citing poetry about that landscape while also being scientists. We might have completely different ways of approaching the landscape. It might be through food, it might be through magic, it might be through trauma, or through migration stories. And we actually need to be able to say we need all of those, right? If we want to talk about land, we need a plurality of stories, because all of these issues of border crossing, of identity, are already in the conversation the second we turn our attention to land. Thanks, Jessica. Louisa, is there for you something that constitutes good writing?
Yeah, I think the most important thing for me really is about being honest, and about also being accessible. So I believe that literature should be available to everybody to engage with, and I prefer writing that is more simple, that's more unpretentious, that's very authentic. And there's a really sort of millennial phrase about being true to yourself, which is a bit sort of cheesy, but I do think that with good writing, it is about sort of honouring your experiences, whether they're, and just being sort of honest about those. And I think that, as Jessica was saying, I think that different people, we see the world through our own lenses. And if you move through the world as, for example, a privileged human being, you're going to see the world in that way. But if you move through the world as somebody who's from a marginalised group, then, you know, for some people it doesn't feel safe to go into the countryside. For people of Black and Asian heritage, it's sort of become quite widely known that some people just simply don't feel safe being in those spaces for various reasons. So I think that, yeah, we will bring something different to nature writing, and that's the beauty of it. I think diversity is the beauty of having good nature writing.
Thank you. Madeleine, what's your sense of this? I mean, even as someone that doesn't proclaim to be a nature writer, is there a good way of writing about nature? You're muted still, Madeleine.
Okay, I should be off now. Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah. I have a special section of my sort of bookshelves very close to my desk where my most favorite writers are, and Kathleen Jamie is there, Rebecca Solnit is there, Mary Oliver, some of her prose writing in particular, and I think that there's a humility to all of those writers that I really, really value, that they don't claim expertise or they don't intellectualize, they're not trying to show off. And so I feel it's a very, very intimate engagement that they're revealing to the reader. Somebody who I think has absolutely cracked it in a new book that's coming out, it's about to arrive through my letterbox, and I just think it's the most beautiful piece of nature writing I've read in a really long time, is written by Frank Rennie, who lives in the northernmost part of Lewis, the island of Lewis in the Hebrides, and he's written a book that must become a classic. It's absolutely beautiful, about the landscape in which he has lived. He's a geographer by background, so he brings tremendous expertise, but he carries his learning very lightly. And really what he's writing about is a place where he lives. And I suppose part of why it resonates with me so much is my interest in home, how human beings can feel at home, because I think so many of us don't have that great sense of grounding, and the grounding in that book. I mean, one of the things about Kathleen Jamie when I first read her was that she would talk about the peregrine and then loading the washing machine, and you know, that was just the most wonderful moment. I was, you know, cheering away, because I just thought, actually, that's the experience of, you know, a huge number of women, that their experience of nature is always juggling domestic tasks of sustaining human lives, you know, their children, their families and parents and so forth. So so something of that humility and modesty and groundedness is what I really appreciate.
Do you think that was something that was kind of obscured, if you like, by, if I can coin the term, old nature writing?
Well, I absolutely. I think, you know, the grand old man tradition of nature writing is, you know, it's a bit like, you know, the story, you know, who cooked Adam Smith's dinner? You know, well, you know, who washed the muddy trousers when this great sort of botanist returned from the field? So I think we've been, you know, it's been a very male dominated, and that's meant that it's had a great emphasis on discovery and the adventurousness of the sort of male striking out into the wilderness. You know, there's quite an interesting contrast between the writing that really took hold of people's imagination in the 80s, which was travel writing like Bruce Chatwin. And then, you know, his kind of, in a sense, Rob McFarlane took over from Bruce Chatwin, and both are wonderful writers, but discovery and the sort of I'm going to tell you what this is all about type sort of sense, you know, in some sense they're both, you know, profoundly teachers, but I wonder if there's a form of teaching which is more about which is something a bit more, you know, less like lecturing you from the front of the hall, but sitting down beside you and pointing something out at your feet, which is what Mary Oliver is so brilliant at.
Louisa, you look as though you wanted to come in on that, and I kind of do want to.
I was just agreeing about Mary Oliver. Sorry.
Oh, right, okay, yeah, but I mean, your thoughts on, I mean, you know, diversity, particular, is something that you're passionate about.
Yeah.
Do the right people have the right degree of voice in relation to that task of describing praising and exploring nature?
Well, I think up until recently, it's been, as we've all been talking about, it's been very much dominated by a single narrative. And I think that things are beginning to change, which is obviously really positive. But I still think we have some way to go, because generally in the publishing industry and the literary world, it is still dominated by sort of one type of person. And I do feel that it is still quite elitist as well, really. There's lots of barriers which prevent writers from a wide range of backgrounds from actually being published and being heard. But I think we are moving forward in a more positive direction, particularly this last couple of years. I've seen a real surge around nature writing and diversifying those voices. So yeah, I didn't answer your question properly, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's good. And Jessica, I mean, you are part of that, in a sense, that change.
I mean, I think it's down to the writers themselves, really. We just run a platform. But I do think, we are getting to the point now where it's sort of inexcusable for people to start saying that they don't know of any nature writers of color, they don't know of any disabled writers of color, or women writers, women nature writers, or disabled nature writers. You know what I mean? Like we're at the point now where there are so many people doing the work and trying to sort of get their voices out there that publishers and agents need to take note, but also readers. I really think, there is a lot more choice out there right now. And I would just love to see us devote as much attention to their work and their craft as we do to this issue of like, do we have enough representation on a basic level? Because we need more than that. We need to acknowledge these writers as writers. We need to actually give them the same support and the same amount of attention as we do to a lot of the sort of big name writers that I think we've already talked about.
Thanks, Jessica. Well, let me turn. That's a very good cue in a way for me to turn to our contributors. And Mahima, perhaps you'd like to, maybe go back to my first question in a sense. What is it that you seek through writing?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think finally I can connect it to the conversation we've just been having, because when I read nature writing, I loved nature and I loved reading, but I didn't connect with what Madeleine described as, that grand old man version of nature writing. And I blamed myself, I felt guilty, like I hadn't done my homework or something. But the truth is I didn't know what a bog was, or I didn't know what a coppice was or what a holloway was and felt like. And so my eyes would glaze over. So when I saw, your and Ian and Kate's call for new nature writing, I saw it as an amazing opportunity to lay claim to nature writing in a way that reflected my experience and that people like me could connect with. Because the reality is the majority of the world's population experiences nature in this way, and I'll be reading from my piece later, but it's a very urban and sometimes ugly morph of nature. And I do think it's a bit of a limitation that we have so few flavors of nature that are described and celebrated. And, there's this sort of wild, rugged nature, there's sort of pastoral, rural nature, but those two visions exclude many of us who live in sort of an urban environment, and we can't afford for that to happen. We want to be able to open up the title of nature lover and nature writer to a broader church. And then, there has to be a way for someone to be urban and love nature, or to be urban and fight for nature. And that's sort of what drew me to nature writing, or my first attempt at it.
Thanks, Mahima. Orla, what you describe in Ignorance and Bliss is it's a kind of uneasy relationship to the task of writing about nature, isn't it? Even though you bring that attention to bear so clearly on that uneasiness. What was it that attracted you to that task?
I think, I totally agree with Mahima there, that when I saw the call for the competition, I just thought, yes, that's exactly what I've been missing in nature writing that I've read so far. Or it was just articulated, that kind of lone enraptured male. I'd never heard that before, but it totally made sense. But maybe the uneasiness comes from just lack of confidence. I think in some of the classic nature writing, there's a lot of unspoken confidence in it, that, you go out in these landscapes, not necessarily to dominate them, maybe just to observe them, but there's a lot of, clarity of thought and purpose in that writing, and that's not me really. So I think just all the nuance and the grey and the both grey in terms of concrete and grey in terms of, you know, unknown. I think I'd like to bring that a bit more to bear in just nature writing in general. Yeah.
One of the themes in the contributions that we had, and it's one that Ian mentioned right at the beginning, that Kate and Ian talk about in their paper, and that each of you in some ways has talked about on the panel, is the kind of, and it's to do with our relationship to nature, but a particular way in which that relationship to nature seems to help us in addressing trauma. And I'd just like to explore that a bit further. It was very interesting that we had actually quite a few of the contributions that we had, and I hope maybe some of those are actually panelists listening that I might be able to draw into the conversation later. But actually in some way, both Orla and Mahima and several of the other writers in more specifically actually began to talk through their writing about nature, about trauma, about the things in their own life. And I wanted to explore that a little bit. How important is that? How much of an element in new nature writing is that exploration of trauma? Louisa?
Yeah, this is one of my favourite subjects, actually. I think it's incredibly important. And so just as an example, I lost a very, very close friend of mine nearly 2 years ago now. And one of the things that helped me with my grief was writing. And I was very much drawing on images from the natural world. So it was birds. I was drawn to birds and the sky and light, the gold light, and trees and plants. And I felt very connected with nature through my journey of grief. And I think that the writers whose essays were selected, I think there was a lot of exploration around trauma and mental health. And I think that's really, really important. I think that probably even more so now, sort of post pandemic, when, you know, I'm pretty sure that a lot of people are really struggling with their mental health, and it's been very traumatic for a lot of people. And I think that nature is a really important way of not sort of healing per se, but it's a way of beginning that process. It's a way of feeling connected when you're going through something incredibly difficult, and it can help. I feel it can help sort of support you. So, for example, with lockdown, the first lockdown, one of the first things I did was get outside, and I'd been, you know, we all try and make time for this kind of thing, and I'd just been so busy. And I just turned the computer off and went down the road, and I was 5 minutes away from the countryside. And in that space, I just felt so sort of supported and grounded and held, and it helped me with my writing as well. So I think they're really, really important things. And I think that it's a really positive way, actually, of dealing with trauma and supporting our mental health and well-being. And it's something I feel really, really passionate about. So, yeah.
I mean, if I can push a little bit further, what's the currency of that offering from nature in terms of dealing with trauma? What is it that nature offers that kind of allows us to deal with trauma more easily in its presence?
Yeah, I don't know. That's quite a difficult question. I think it's that sort of, as we were talking about earlier, that sort of feeling of being grounded and being able to reflect on our problems in a different way. Because when we're in those spaces, you know, our lives become not irrelevant, but we can just place ourselves and see them as actually quite small. And sometimes what our first world problems, in the scale of things, they're not actually always as serious as perhaps we might think they are. And I feel as though nature and the countryside can sort of, it just feels as though we're supported, like we're literally supported by the earth that we walk on, that's holding us up. I don't know, I sound like I'm going a bit sort of, a bit wacky or whatever, but that's just how I feel. It feels as though it supports us and holds us and helps and grounds us. And if we can reflect on that in our writing, it just adds beauty and richness and depth to our work.
Thanks. Jessica, can I ask, what is your sense of that?
Well, I think, there is, of course, very often that sort of turn towards trauma, but the thing I sort of really was struck by in reading all of the pieces was perhaps actually I would use a different word, and that was it's about vulnerability, right? There was an incredible amount of vulnerability that these writers put forward in what we were seeing. And I think in many ways that is, I mentioned earlier this idea of intimacy being a bridge to sort of community and to care. That vulnerability in going out into the natural world and saying, I do know about this, or I don't know about it, and I want to sort of, in a sensory way, be open to that experience, and I'm going to allow myself to feel these feelings. That's the sort of the first demolition of the wall that we might have, right? To connecting with place, to connecting with others, and that for me, I think, it really came through in the pieces that we received pretty much across the board, which I was kind of astounded by, because that is a challenge, I think, for many people. And is, I would say, like, on a basic level, that's the first step that we need in order to sort of really make vivid our connection with a place.
Thanks, Jessica. Mahima, I saw you nodding there. Do you want to come in and say something about that from your perspective of writing?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I'd like to build off of the point that Jessica was making. I was thinking about it in the context of children, and someone mentioned this in the session earlier today as well. And a lot of children are born these days in these sort of concrete jungles, but they continue to be drawn to nature in whatever form it shows itself. And so it does make me wonder, if this desire for nature is primal and sort of embedded in our genes, even in some way, and not a taught thing. Something that we're craving before we even know what it is. And to not have that as an urban child, to be able to not make sense of the discrepancy between sort of the stories we're told about, trees and rainbows and wild animals and the world, we're looking out at, which is like one of buildings and cars and crowds. I think there is a little bit of that, reconciliation that needs to happen. That goes back to the theme of my piece, which is around how do you mobilize these people and these children actually around an idea of nature that, is something that they can connect with and can still love in some way. And I think, removing them from that is in its own way a sort of trauma.
Thanks, Mahima. Madeleine, what is your sense of this? I mean, obviously you write in particular your, as we now know, your most recent book about the importance of care and that relationship, and how is that expressed in place and through nature?
Well, it's such a sort of rich, complex relationship. If we had a care ethic that was absolutely at the centre of our culture, as opposed to a work ethic, I think it would have multiple benefits, both for the environmental crisis and for the human crisis. It's almost like, turning everything sort of round and looking at it from another perspective. And one of the things in the book that I reflected on, I mean, the book is about interviewing all sorts of people in different contexts of offering care, whether they paid professional work or within intimate family relationships. But care is so often about attention, and that came up quite early in the discussion today. In the end, nature writing seems to me a huge part of its purpose, which was one of the questions that you sent us, Tim. It is about a kind of bringing to our attention. And care is primarily about a way of paying attention. And that's at the heart of both the environmental crisis and the human crisis that we're facing, which is, are we paying attention to the things that really matter, as opposed to getting hugely distracted all the time? So I sort of see a major kind of political battlefield, if you like, around this question of attention. There are so many really well organized, powerful commercial interests trying to get our attention and to keep us distracted. So care is also about presence. Care is and being truly present, in that lovely sense Louisa had of, lucky her being able to go down the road in lockdown to the countryside. Well, I had the park just 10 minutes down the road, which I'm deeply fond of, but is a bit of a muddy patch. But it's amazing how much joy you can still find in a sort of East End London kind of muddy patch. And like her, I got such strength out of that. And funnily enough, the thing that has absolutely been crucial the whole of this year is the most beautiful thing that my very elderly, very, very frail mother told me in January. She was remembering how as a teenager she had seen on the wall an engraving on the wall of her piano teacher's study. And her piano teacher was a Russian emigre who had fled the Russian Revolution and fled Paris under the German invasion. And she had on her wall this engraving of trees, and it said, "Be still, my heart, for these great trees are prayers." And my mother, aged 88, had remembered it all her life. And I had a sense of the trauma of her teacher, which goes way back to 1917 and before that. So in this extraordinary moment, because my mother most of the time is quite confused, I felt that there was 100 years of female history of experiencing challenge and difficulty and finding solace in trees. And the trees in my local park, you know, they're wonderful big plane trees, and they're so scarred and they're a bit sagging and there's great bulges of growth, and yet they hold up these huge branches. So that sort of symbol of stability and balance has kept me going all the way through lockdown.
That's fantastic. And it kind of, it brings me on nicely in a way to something that we have to talk about, to talk about nature as being something that can hold our trauma and the space of our trauma and give us back this connectedness is, of course, to speak to some extent from the perspective of our own interests. You know, ask not what you can do for nature, but what nature can do for us. But there is a sense, and it's very much the sense that Ian and Kate had when they brought forward this call, that nature writing and writing about nature can be a form of activism. It can take us towards the common good. It can deliver more than just the intensification of our relationship with nature, important though that is, and reflecting, important as it is to reflect that. It can change the way that we behave towards nature. And so I just, in this little last round with the panelists before I open up to some Q&A, I just wanted to explore that a little bit. Jessica, perhaps I could start with you. Can nature writing be something in pursuit of the common good?
Absolutely. I think, you know, there is a central tension, at least that I found in my work and that I see very often, and it is between this idea of opening towards a wider sense of community, opening to, you know, the sort of richness of the natural world, as we might say, beyond our sort of human-centered, you know, anthropocentric approaches, while also realizing that we are often pulled in that direction, right? But the thing I always come back to is this idea of, you know, just perhaps not dismissing canon, but the idea of opening up our sense of what nature writing could be and drawing on a wider range of and a wider pool of inspiration. In my own work, I've been turning a lot to Taiwanese nature writing, and I come to this example really often because Taiwanese nature writing is a very young genre and only really emerged in the 80s and the 90s, and emerged sort of concurrent with agitation and activism for democracy as Taiwan was emerging from martial law. Prior to that point, prior to the late 80s, when martial law was lifted, to even go out with binoculars to go bird watching, you could have been accused of espionage. People couldn't do that. So this idea of conservation, of appreciation for the natural world, is inextricably tied up with activism and with democracy in Taiwan. And that's really reflected in the writing. So I think if we're able to keep that in mind and open up to different kinds of traditions for what our nature writing can be, I think we could see a lot more of that, if that makes sense, a greater sense of community and different models for what that might look like.
Right, thanks, Jessica. Louisa, can nature writing save the planet?
Well, let's hope so. I thought that was really interesting what Jessica said about sort of not being able to go out in Taiwan with binoculars. And I think that just to kind of pick up on that point, I think it's really interesting to think that you know, actually just engaging in nature is a privilege that we don't all have, and we haven't always had throughout the history of time. I've just started reading a book called The Book of Trespass, which what's the author called? Nick, I've forgotten his surname, sorry, Nick, beginning with H. Anyway, that's really about land ownership and who owns the land, and it goes back over hundreds of years, and it's fascinating, this idea that land actually belongs to human beings when really we belong to the land, you know, and we should be more responsible towards it. I think in terms of activism, as Jessica was saying about the sort of widening out the community and the telling different stories, I think that absolutely nature writing can be a tool for social change and activism, because simply by telling the stories of different people who inhabit those spaces but already raising awareness about those lived experiences, so that's, you know, that's one way that it can be done. And I think also picking up on Mahima talking about children engaging with nature, I think that engaging with nature can be done in a way where you support children and young people to engage with it in a way that they understand the impact of what we're doing to the planet. And I feel very hopeful that the younger generation particularly are really, you know, they're really outspoken activists about what's going on, and I sort of believe in them. You know, if anyone's going to sort everything out, you know, I believe it will be young people, because they just seem to be so engaged and, you know, very politically engaged and politically aware. So yeah, I think there's different ways in which nature writing can be a tool for activism and social change and planetary change.
So that's a really interesting point, the point about young people, because it's clearly true. And is that a part of your motivation then for this sort of inclusivity of voices, is that if you bring in the people who actually care about this change most and give them a voice, then that's the best way of creating that change, or a way of creating that change?
I've never actually thought about it, but that's a really good way of framing it. Some of the work I've been doing recently, so I'm part of a team called Wild Collaborative, and we support young people and children this is particularly in parks, so we support them to go into green spaces and to write about their green spaces, exploring themes like well-being and health and history and the environment and so on. But I think that is it's a good example of how, you know, if you're invested in something, if you care about something, if you engage with something, then you're going to be more invested in its future. So thank you for sort of framing that in a very very good way that I've not thought about before.
You're welcome. Entirely accidental. Madeleine, I mean, is it a legitimate task to ask of writing to be an agent of change? Is there a danger of instrumentalizing art itself as nothing more than an agent of change? Is there something, if you like, pure about art that we should keep for art's sake, or is it always an agent of change?
There's so many different ways to answer that question, and I think about it a lot. But I will start with something that might sound a little bit pretentious. When I was a very, very intense teenager, I read André Gide, and he has a sentence which has absolutely kind of been indelibly printed on my brain. And I even remember it in the French. My accent is terrible these days, but it was, you know, I was studying French A-level. But it's basically the book that leaves you intact. Le livre qui le laisse intact, c'est le livre qui a manqué. So the book that has failed is the book that leaves you unchanged. And, you know, I think that I've never ever forgotten that, for, you know, very clear reason. I'm afraid that's the bar that I put on every book I read. And it is certainly my constant sort of compass point, if you like, that I am always hoping to change people's minds, even if it's tiny changes. You know, one could be modest as well as ambitious at the same time. But I think every writer wants to open the other person, their reader's imagination in some way. And if you're asking me, should that desire to open the imagination be kind of targeted in a very specific way towards, you know, a very specific political end? Well, that is a certain type of political writing. Arundhati Roy does it completely brilliantly. She's, you know, when it comes to sort of polemic about the role of dams in India, there's no one better than Arundhati Roy at that kind of powerful polemic, and that is a very valuable form of writing. So it's different kinds of writing serve different kinds of purposes. Will writing create a new environmental awareness, which I think is probably what you're asking, Tim. And I think it contributes. I think Mark Cocker is right to say that it's not going fast enough and doing enough. But I think there's also a question of, that there is a real challenge around the mourning and grief lament point that Ian raised at the beginning of the session, which is that reading is always at some level a pleasurable activity. And if it becomes a sort of, how much grief can we cope with? And I think that's a kind of major challenge for the environmental movement, entire environmental movement, not just writers. When Mark Cocker writes, I'm grief stricken, because he's absolutely right. We've lost, 90% of farm birds in this country. So my childhood growing up in North Yorkshire, the birds I listened to as a child, you're hard put to hear them in the countryside now. So even in the course of my life, we've seen a total environmental catastrophe in this country. And the extent to which we're aware of it is still so limited.
So writing must play some role in communicating that, in changing that.
Yeah, this is where I think fiction does it better actually than non-fiction. So if I think of the book that has profoundly left me haunted, it's Cloud Atlas. And I'll put that in the chat. But it seems to me that David Mitchell reminded us of where we're heading, where we're hurtling at such sort of breakneck speed that it's no longer sort of science fiction anymore. And I found it a profoundly uncomfortable book to read as a consequence.
It is a fantastic book. What it doesn't do, though, is point us in any open way towards policy prescriptions, certainly, or even a clear sense of where
so there's two.
Actions lie.
I think, Tim, that's a sort of second question. One is writing activist? Is it about raising awareness? And then is it about offering kind of solutions? And these are huge challenges to throw down to writers. And I think that the book, which is about giving us some sense of how to go forward, how to kind of bring about change, well, it would be Wilding by Isabella Tree that I can't think of a book that's had a more profound impact, because everybody seems to be talking about how do they rewild, can they rewild the end of their garden or their, it's developed this fascination in the idea that we could actually do something very dramatic. It's certainly not policy. I mean, that comes as close as it does, as writing can do, to policy proposals. And still be really, really good writing.
Thanks, Madeleine. Mahima and Orla. Mahima, would you mind if I want to break up the flow of the intellectual discussion a little bit. So I'm going to ask you in just a couple of minutes or so, perhaps to read your extract before we go to the Q&A, which is now hotting up. Lots of people would like to ask something. So in a couple of minutes, I'd like to turn to you to read your extract. But just before that, both of you really, Orla as well, what you both work in sustainability, really. You both you are social activists. How do you see your writing, and in particular this nature writing project, in relation to that activism?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I'm happy to go first. I think one thing that's missing is really, what you guys at CUSP focus on is this picture of what a good life can look like. And since the Industrial Revolution, obviously we have this, these growth is good narratives. We have, consumer is king, and more economic success means more well-being. And that narrative is obviously fraying a bit around the edges, especially in the middle of this pandemic, where people have realized that good health and a clean environment are, things that can't be measured or captured in sort of our economic account of the world. And I do feel like now is the right moment to replace that narrative. And that is where I feel, nature writing is not the silver bullet, but it does have an important part to play, because that shared vision of what good looks like doesn't exist in in sort of a pervasive way. It exists in pockets maybe, but it hasn't come to dominate in the way that we need it to. And I think, going back to Orlaith's point in her piece, which I think was so well made, the trick will actually be to do this in the sort of dramatic global economic and cultural context where there's so many differences and so many inequalities, because we know that we can't reverse our environmental crises without bringing sort of the rest of the world along with us. And yet we have vegetarianism and veganism on the rise in the UK and the US and the West, but meat eating is actually on the rise in India and China. So how do you convince the billions rising into the middle classes in India and China and on the African continent that their first car should be not a regular gas guzzler, but an electric vehicle? There needs to be a way for their aspirations to like leapfrog the very sort of unsustainable journey that we went on in the West over the last 50, 100 years. And obviously the complication is that we can't impose that narrative, from the outside. That needs to come from within. And so, artists of all sorts, including writers, they have a big task ahead of them, but particularly those who can speak to and speak for those in our sort of global society who are entirely urban or who are only just sort of climbing onto that ladder of prosperity.
So it's a very interesting distinction you kind of smuggled in at the end there, which I really like: speak to and speak for. And obviously that's one of the tensions that probably haunts the task of using artistic writing and nature writing as an element of that, as an agent of change. What do you think is needed to sort of bridge that tension between speaking to, using art as an instrument of change, if you like, and speaking for, representing the interests of those whose lives we would wish might change?
I'm happy to answer that, or try and answer that briefly. But I think in the earlier session today, someone was talking about the fact that we are in the Anthropocene now, whereas previously we were in the Holocene. And because we are in the Anthropocene, it's sort of incumbent on us to recognize that. And you look at someone like David Attenborough and his evolution. Of course, he's not a nature writer, but let's call him a nature communicator. He's recognized that he has to take on environmental challenges and talk about them and communicate about them. It's not forgivable to sort of provide, just escapism and call it that. The same way it's no longer okay to just teach literature without giving the context of the time in which the literature was written. And so I think the distinction between speaking for and speaking to, I think nature writers do have to do both. And speaking to has to be in an educational way, but not in a patronizing way. And speaking for does have to be in a sort of an engaging way, but not a divisive way. And I think...
Thanks. That's really, Mahima, I just gave you such a horrible question there. I really apologize, but thank you for... I'm just going to give you a couple of seconds to gather your thoughts and your breath before you read to us, and just to pose the similar sort of question to Orla. There is something particularly about your essay, Orla, that was very, down to earth. You made no claims to knowledge. In fact, you almost the opposite. And so where do you see the, writing as an element in your own activism? Because again, you have a kind of career in as an activist in some sense in sustainability.
I think, maybe it's the Irish person in me that reacts badly to being called an activist or any sort of expert in it. But Mahima and I both work in sustainability, and we're just meeting for the first time today, and I hope we can, have another chat outside of this. But I think working in the space, we've been talking about nature writing kind of provide the solutions, and my gut reaction was no, there's a whole industry looking, to create the solutions to the climate and biodiversity and environmental and natural crises. And we need to listen to that science, and maybe it's the limits of my own imagination of how nature writing could contribute to that. But I think it's just what Mahima said. Really, it's painting that vision of the future and painting what a good life looks like, and that's why the competition is well titled "Nature Writing for the Common Good," because when I look at politics, for example, I don't see political parties putting forward a vision for the future, a really ambitious vision for the future, you know, they talk about it, but they don't, I can't understand what that life would look like. So that's exactly, I think, where nature writing comes in, or new nature writing. It's helping people understand, can you imagine what it would be like if we did, you know, if we properly took nature into account and all of that. So reading that is very, very powerful. But in terms of actually delivering, you know, technical solutions, I think that's the preserve of the sustainability world.
Orla. So we will come to the participants for some questions. There's quite a lot of interest in the discussion and lots of questions. But this is a chance to hear an extract from one of the other submissions to the call for nature writing, and it's a piece called Where the Kites Fly by Mahima Sukhdev.
Thank you, Tim. Mumbai, with its 18 million people crammed into a narrow strip of land, is a big, loud, chaotic city. When nature lands here, she falls seamlessly in step with the anonymous droves flowing along the roads. In the city, she's an urbanite. She hasn't got time for frivolities, she doesn't linger for longer than she needs to, and she dresses practically, wearing only sensible shoes. I grew up with nature in this apparition. When I was 2 years old, I would ask to go to Bajji ke yahan, which can be literally translated from Hindi to Bajji's place. Bajji's place was the Bombay Gymkhana, a local sports club that my parents would frequent, ostensibly to play badminton, but really just to spend some time outside our cramped little apartment where they could hear the sounds of the horns from the traffic below, despite being on the 14th floor. In the Gymkhana, there was a dusty playground with a metal slide, a plastic swing set, and a budgerigar in a cage. I would spend hours watching the colorful bird while my parents sat on white wicker chairs, sipped on fresh lime sodas, and watched me. My parents loved telling the story, and I liked it when they told it because it reaffirmed a belief that I held to be true, that I have always been, a nature lover. I held this belief gingerly, though, somewhat apologetically. I was, after all, a child born of concrete. The World Health Organization recommends at least 20 square meters of green space per capita in big cities. London, with its many parks and gardens, has an abundant 50 square meters per capita. Delhi has 15, and Mumbai has 2. In this crowded city, where could a love of nature come from? Where could it turn to? My indulgence in nature was amateur, a series of false starts and misdirected fervor, like a hatchling imprinting on the wrong mother. The plague. In 1994, a plague swept through India via Mumbai. The newspapers ran front-page stories about the plague almost every day. Events were cancelled, people stayed indoors. The hustle-bustle of our city was muted, like someone had turned a giant dial and lowered the volume. Sounds familiar. One morning, the whole school was gathered in the assembly hall, and our principal invited a suited, mustached man onto the stage. He spoke to us for a long time in a serious tone, using big words that most of us didn't understand. Bubonic, he said, and the hungry girls thought of bourbon biscuits. Yersinia pestis, he said, and the Christian girls thought of Latin prayers. Vectors, he said, and the older girls thought of maths class, probably. We shuffled out of the assembly hall, fearful, but also a bit excited. We were starting to develop egos and understand history, and for the first time in our young lives, we felt like we might be a part of the story of the world. While most of my friends were celebrating the unexpected school holidays, I was quietly concerned about the plight of the city's rats, innocent carriers of the deadly disease. Everybody suddenly hated them. We had shared our city with these creatures. We went about our days, they went about theirs. We dared not question their decision to migrate to Mumbai. That would inevitably lead to more introspective questions we didn't want to ask ourselves about waste or scarcity or nativism. But now there was a growing intolerance. They spoke about rats in a vitriolic rage I couldn't understand. Couldn't they see that they meant no harm? And the rats were dying as well in great numbers. The plague came and went, and the newspapers never published the rat death count. I thought of them being poisoned, becoming suddenly inert on the roadside like little balls of grade cotton wool. In my big city, for the first time, I saw people turn against nature in fear. The prison. At the beginning of the monsoon season, when the rains had newly flushed out the subsurfaces of the city, I collected 5 slugs that were loitering near the car park beneath our building. I put them in a shoebox and proudly installed the shoebox in our living room. They were our first pets. With a planning horizon typical of my age, now 7, it was only once the slugs were housed that I became concerned with what they would need to eat. This was before the internet era, so I trolled through encyclopedias searching for this information in vain, becoming increasingly panicked. My mother assured me that if we just created a bedding of mud in the shoebox and threw in some leaves and small plants, they'd be all right. I took good care of my slug pets. I gave them all names and I could tell them apart too. If you spend enough time with any group of animals, you'll notice the things that make each one unique. The thickness of the line along their backs, the shape of their tentacles, the frilliness of their skirts. Once I got comfortable with them, I started to set them free on the kitchen floor for a while so they could get some fresh air and exercise, time out of cell, so to speak. Alas, once they had tasted freedom, there was no turning back. The details of the incident are fuzzy in my memory, and my mother can't seem to verify the facts, but one night, 4 of the 5 slugs escaped the shoebox. They didn't make their way very far across our beige living room carpet, and the slime trails they left behind meant it was particularly easy to trace and apprehend them. Someone had perhaps not left the shoebox lid on correctly. Instead of swathes of manure, I had my slugs ghostly midnight trails. Instead of vast grassy fields, I had a few carpet knots per square inch. But in my big city, I reared animals with my own routines and rituals. The hanging gardens. We wandered through a dense thicket, and the dirt path ahead of us narrowed as the underbrush took over. For a manic moment, we were wielding our arms like machetes, pushing branches out of our way. We might have been in a rainforest, but for the occasional wail of a police siren. And then, abruptly, we spilled out into a sunny patch of manicured lawn. The benefit of being little is that the spaces around you appear endlessly large. The majestic hanging gardens, I now know, is a small but much-loved terraced garden and park, perched on top of Mumbai's Malabar Hill. My early visit to the hanging gardens were driven by a desire to explore, to experience a little patch of nature. Later, I would come to see the trips as a necessity. Adenanthera pavonina, a perennial tree, commonly known as red lucky seed, abundant in Mumbai's hanging gardens. The ground was scattered with thousands of their red, disc-like seeds. They look like Smarties, my little sister once pointed out, bright, glossy, and uniform, just missing the chocolate center. We started collecting these seeds, a handful at a time at first, and kept them in matchboxes and played games with them. But soon they caught the fancy of the other girls in our school. The seeds were beautiful and versatile. They could be strung into necklaces, used for artwork, or simply collected and displayed. We went back to the hanging gardens to harvest more, and our stores moved from matchboxes to glass jars. They became a form of currency for trade with our friends. We'd exchange them for stickers, collectible toys, and even for favors. You let me copy your homework, I'll give you 20 seeds. And after that, whenever I visited the hanging gardens, I would only be fixated on the ground, eyes wide in a state of hungered frenzy, scanning for seeds. In my big city, I experienced a small piece of wilderness and marveled at its many mysteries. And then I learned how to reap the fruits of nature for my own gain, and it changed how I saw the wilderness. The petition. I carefully folded the pages of the petition together and put them in a big brown envelope, along with the covering letter. 300 signatures, I said to myself proudly. Surely the Chinese ambassador would give our petition the attention it deserved. It was 1997, and we were waking up to the realization that India's tigers were really and truly threatened with extinction. One big reason for this was the illegal trade in tiger parts, and most of the demand for tiger parts came from China. I had spent the last few weeks going from classroom to classroom and lunch table to lunch table, collecting signatures. Most of the girls, welcoming any break from regular classwork or fickle friends, enthusiastically signed the petition. My earliest understanding of how the real world worked, globalization, supply and demand, the role of diplomacy, came from putting this petition together. None of the girls cared to test my half-baked knowledge of the above. All I had to say was, "The tigers are going extinct and we have to save them, sign here," and they'd look up at me, word expressions between tightly braided pigtails, and scrawl their names on the paper. We were old enough to be worried about the future, but young enough not to know skepticism. I had never seen a tiger in the wild. Barely any of us had. Yet our collective imaginations were teeming with images of the tiger, India's national animal, the saffron color in our flag, the goddess Durga's trusty steed, the villain in the Jungle Book, the hero in The Tiger Who Came to Tea. My bedroom wall was plastered with photos of tigers cut out from magazines. I was a nature lover and a patriot. And in my big city, I realized that believing is not about seeing, and that nature can be about your country, your culture, and the stories you tell. And I fought for the idea of nature. The god of the sky. I would gaze out of the window of our Mumbai apartment often. The scent of the cool sea breeze lured me over, and the sight of the kites soaring overhead kept me transfixed in a meditative state as the color of the evening turned from yellow to orange to purple. There were really only 3 birds that one would see regularly in the city: the crow, the sparrow, and the kite. They were all decidedly urban birds. Generations ago, their ancestors had left behind their quiet lives in the forest and moved to Mumbai, city of dreams, city of extremes, maximum city. The crow was an ugly, angry bird, a bird of landfill sites and rotten things. Intelligent, yes, resourceful, definitely, but not likable. He didn't even bother pretending he was a bird. He didn't prefer a tree to a trash heap. The sparrow was in my mind a more recent migrant. She retained a little countryside charm, a melodic song reminiscent of another world. She was small and jittery, and she didn't get too close to humans. But the kite was the god of the sky. The kite was both long-term urban resident and altogether transcendent. The kite flew above us all, not involved in the mess we made beneath. An elegant, fierce bird that conjured up all the images of freedom and power an eagle would. Better than an eagle, though, the kite had made it in the big city. And the kite reminded me that there will be life anywhere we allow life to be. And in my big city, with only 2 meters of green space per capita, nature thrived on the y-axis. In a shoebox on the 14th floor, in the terraced gardens on top of a hill, in the saffron on a flag hoisted high and proudly unfurled, and in the space between the tallest skyscraper and the stratosphere, where the kites would fly. Thank you.
That was Where the Kites Fly. Mahima, thank you. That was lovely, beautifully read, as Orla did, and thanks again for your courage in doing that. Not the easiest thing in the world to do at all. And again, I'm sure if we were able to hear the applause, we would very definitely be deafened by it. So I want to come back to some of our conversations, but to draw in also some of our panelists, and also, so please do turn your videos back on. Maybe Kate and Ian, you could join us as well as the questions come in, and to draw in also some of our participants. So now I've got I have one of our participants is actually one of the other contributors to the series, and it's Liz Child. So Liz, I was wondering if you would like to pose your question, particularly I suppose the questions that you were asking about our responsibility towards nature and the role of nature writing in helping, in if you like, that question about activism that we were asking. Perhaps you could ask that question to the panel.
I wish I'd written it down.
Shall I read it for you? Actually, I do have a version of it that you wrote down, but it's your thoughts really about, whether nature actually has the capacity to offer us more, shouldn't it be? It sort of goes back, as I read it, to that question that I was saying, before: ask not what you can do for nature, but what nature can do for you. What's the role of writing in that? Was something like what you were asking, and maybe tell us a little bit about how you approached that in your essay?
I've heard for very many years, it feels like, that nature has been endangered. And so for me, responsibility has been the key feature. And I'm new to writing, and you can hear the tremor in my voice, I think, that I'm really quite emotional about it. But the responsibility element is so important to me, because we, the great we focus on ourselves way too much. And I would love to read more where we focus on the natural world, how it works, the ecology of it, increase our understanding about it, and challenge ourselves to let it be on a par with us. We still consider ourselves very highly, and perhaps I feel that writing is, I'm answering my question, but I feel that there is a responsibility to nature writers to explain to ourselves what we are doing wrong.
Okay, thank you. That was very eloquently put. And I kind of want to turn to Madeleine first, perhaps to address that. Madeleine. You're just muted.
Yeah, sorry. I was busy tapping in a recommendation, Liz, the great classic by Annie Dillard, Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, which is a wonderful work from the 1970s, where I think she absolutely leaves the kind of, the human preoccupations behind to really try and understand the place that she's living in. I think there are different writers for different purposes, different readers. My approach is that I do take company into nature with me. Although I admire Nan Shepherd's form of mysticism, it's a very lonely form of mysticism. And, I look back over the last decades of my life, and they have been full of relationship, largely family, children, raising children. How do you teach children to enjoy walks over Scottish moors, which are teeming, with rain, and they've got mud up to their knees? Trying to introduce young people to the world that I appreciate. It makes me very relational. And I think that there's a sort of challenge coming back from various people that that's not enough. And that we need to leave our relational preoccupations to one side to focus on the sort of unfolding crisis. And I have to admit to a certain kind of confusion on that. I'm not quite sure where my specific role is in that, because of course every writer writes in out of their own sort of perspective.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it is a really challenging question. Jessica, where do you stand on it? If you like, our ability to learn and to flourish and to be nourished by nature on the one hand, and yet a sort of responsibility that we should be taking through our writing.
I think this brings us back to this issue of attention and the value of attention, because I think, like, one of the key things that nature writers can do right now is document and bear witness. And I think that doesn't need to be on human terms. Of course, there is that aspect there, but, I think one of the greatest goals we could set ourselves is to lean into giving life to these small details that might otherwise go unnoticed. And I think that really pushes us beyond the human and pushes us beyond our quest for solace in nature and our quest for you know, restorative qualities in nature, and rather allows the world to sort of be much richer and more vivid than we ourselves are alone. So I think it's really comes down to this issue of bearing witness.
Mm-hmm. That's a nice way to think about it. Louisa.
I didn't really know how to sort of respond, but then I just want to say that I agree with Madeleine about when she was saying sort of about being unsure of her role, and I think I feel the same, because in relation to this kind of question about responsibility to explain to ourselves what we're doing to the natural world, I think that my focus has really very much been on humans and working to, you know, to challenge inequality and to raise awareness about the inequality that exists in these spaces. But for me, the two go hand in hand. So I feel as though if we reduce inequality and bring about inclusion for human beings, it feels to me as though it's the same sort of driving force that's gone through the world, you know, bulldozing over the planet, bulldozing over human beings as well. And it's this kind of capitalist way of thinking that we've all been caught up in, you know, for a couple of hundred years. And to me, it feels as though if we can, the two go hand in hand. I feel as though, I don't know if it's my role to sort of explain to people about the damage we're doing to the environment, because I'm not a scientist, and I don't want to sort of, I never want to talk about things that I don't really know that enough about. I don't want to pretend to be an expert on something I don't know enough about, and I'm not really not really scientifically minded. And to me, things like the sea is just a mystery with all these amazing creatures that exist in the sea. So and going back to what Jessica was saying about bearing witness, I feel as though that's possibly more my role, and sort of describing the natural world in relation to human beings. And I think that what Madeleine said about different writers have different roles, and I guess, you know, those roles can change and things can evolve. But for me, I think, yes, it's a really important point, and I like the point that sorry, it was Liz, wasn't it? Liz made about us sort of being very obsessed with, you know, very focused on ourselves and not thinking about the planet. I totally agree, and I think that a lot more needs to be done. But I feel that as writers, we kind of need to do what we do best, perhaps. And there's going to be lots of people for whom writing about the natural world it comes naturally to them and is something they really want to do. Others might want to explore the more human interaction with the natural world and kind of focus more on that. And then some of us might want to look at both and how they kind of go hand in hand. But I'm not really sure if I really added anything of value to that conversation, but I just agree with both what Madeleine and Jessica were saying, different points that I think were really important.
Can I put a question back to Tim? Yeah, can I put a question back to Tim, Ian, and Kate? You know, you've all read lots of these nature writing. So what are your top two books? What would you point to as the books that you found most inspiring and that seemed to you to really, really kind of meet the challenge of our time?
Ian, would you like to take that?
It's a really good question, and I don't think there are many actually which really meet the challenge, and I feel the ambivalence. I really do, because I don't want to turn nature writing into an instrument or agitprop. I want to respect its artistic integrity, but I also think we have to face the brutal fact that the subject matter is being lost. It's being destroyed. It's being degraded, and we can't really turn away from that. Who do I think has connected best on that? I really like the book by Michael McCarthy, The Moth Snowstorm on Nature and Joy. And I think he, especially in the conclusion, he begins to get towards some kind of connection with this idea of the common good, a larger common cause, which doesn't mean you've got to turn yourself into a political creature or political writer. It doesn't mean you've got to turn your sense of care and responsibility and attention towards a bigger common cause and collective effort. So I think that's a really impressive one, and I think we can also get that feeling from some of the older nature writing. One book which means a lot to me, which I've not put into the chat, is A Land by Jacquetta Hawkes, written in 1951, in kind of meditation on the deep time of Britain and what that might mean for our political and social consciousness.
Thanks, Ian. Kate, what would you say?
I completely agree with Ian about Moth Snowstorm, which I think is a tremendous book, and the end is wonderful. But just as an example of how I suppose you get into these things. I mean, I suppose this is a kind of self-own, as they say nowadays, a kind of, we contain multitudes, as it were. My favorite nature writing book, possibly, or the book that got me into nature writing in the first place, is almost an example of everything that I've sort of critiqued in some ways, because it's Richard Maby's Nature Cure. And one might think that that is the most kind of, it's about how he overcomes his own depression, although I think he is such an amazing writer that goes way beyond just talking about his own kind of experience. I do think it's a fantastic book.
Thank you. I've got I'll give you a little thought in a sort of summing up way a little bit later in terms of my response to that, because it's we've got a few people with questions I'd like to bring in. So we've got someone asking, in a way it's a kind of response to this conversation. So Sarah, I'm going to attempt to allow you to talk, and I'd kind of like you to pose your response to this, where you talk about embodied writing. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about that.
Hi, Tim, thank you. So yeah, my question really, I guess it's in response to some of what Madeleine was saying about the relational nature of her writing. And quite a lot of nature writing, I think, kind of separates us as kind of natural beings, human beings, from the natural world. And I wonder whether that is in part a kind of problem that's, a cause of the crisis of relationship that we have with nature. And I just wondered what the panel thought about embodied writing and the place of putting our own embodied experience in response to nature at the centre of the question, not so much to put ourselves at the centre of the question, but to put that kind of relationship that we have with nature at the centre of the question.
Thank you, sir. So you put it quite nicely in the question of using our feelings as a bridge between an inner and an outer world. Who would like to comment on that? Jessica?
I can jump in on that. I can't imagine there's another worthwhile way to approach nature writing other than through embodied writing. I think that's what I set out to do anytime I write, and it's what I look for in good writing about the natural world. I think the thing that I would keep in mind throughout that is that all embodiments will be different, right? And that's actually what it has to offer us, is a sense of sort of visceral being in the world, and how that might be carried out if if your body is different in whatever way it might be. So I don't know. I think there's a lot of work out there that is doing that already and doing it very, very well. Elizabeth Jane Burnett's The Grassling is a book that is simultaneously about family, but about this very visceral sense of being connected to place and environment, while also completely upending so many of our ideas about belonging in Britain and in the nature writing tradition here. So I think there are really a lot of works that are doing all of the things that we're talking about, but they're perhaps not getting as much attention as they ought to.
Just to try and draw in, while we have you there, Jessica, a little bit to follow that up, because in a way it connects to our discussion about voice and who has voice. Because if that task is so embodied and is in relation to individuals and the relationship between individuals and nature, then who has voice really begins to matter, doesn't it? Because that then determines how the relationship with nature is structured in social terms. And we had a question actually from the web, from the YouTube streaming, from Hannah Seiko, and she asks, how far does Jessica and other panelists feel that the industry of literary prizes and associated marketing simply replaces the grand old man's tradition of nature writing with middle-class memoir? What would your response to that be, Jessica?
I think we see a lot of the same stuff getting the big pushes, right? We get a lot of the same kinds of books. It's very samey on the displays when you go in the shop. And I will say this because the nature writers that I spend my time reading, I almost never see on the displays, and I almost never see shortlisted for prizes. I almost never see features about them in the broadsheets. And this is where I do think, there is that aspect of this being a sort of publishing machine, right? There's going to be that pushing out of what works, right? After H is for Hawk came out, like my first book sold the year after that, And every single meeting I went to, people were like, is this going to be our H's for Hawk for this year? You know, and that is sort of what happens in a way. And I think we need, as readers, to actively resist that, to be able to say, I'm looking for something different and I'm going to make a little bit of effort to find out. So it does mean you're going to sometimes be reading authors who might not be, you know, as easy to find. They might not have books published. They might have articles published. You might need to do a bit of research, but there are incredible journals. Like if you look at what's being published in Caught by the River, in the Willow Herb, not to big us up again, in places like Elementum and Emergence magazine, like that stuff is incredible. And I think it ticks a lot of these boxes. We just need to search harder for it. Yeah. I do need to apologize now, Tim. I've already.
I realize you have to go immediately. So good luck tomorrow, and thank you for joining us, Jessica. Louisa.
Sorry, delayed reaction. Yeah, I think so. I think that the literary world has remained incredibly elitist, and I think we do see the same kind of people winning the prizes and, you know, being sort of in the media and having a lot of high profiles. But I do think it is beginning to change. And I think that especially the last few years, we've seen more sort of writers of colour who have had, you know, great successes and so on, but not particularly in this genre. I just wanted to mention Little Toller Books, who I've got a contract with them for a memoir, a coastal memoir, and they publish quite a diverse range of writers, and they've also got a journal called The Clearing, which has some fantastic essays and other pieces on there. So I think it's changing, but it's simply not changing quickly enough, and there's not enough diversity of different voices being out there, particularly around nature writing and this form. I think perhaps in other genres and other forms it is getting more diverse, but this has still got sort of quite a long way to go.
Thanks, Louisa. Madeleine, did you have further thoughts on that?
Well, just briefly, it was quite interesting how my editor on the book that I did the plot in 2009 had edited Rob McFarlane, his first book, in fact. And I remember a conversation in which she was trying to press me to put more personal stuff into my book. My book was about taking an acre of land and exploring how it had been used by centuries of human beings over history. So it spanned right through from prehistory to current day, including and incorporating how my family had used the land. And she was, you know, she was definitely pushing me all the time for more and more of the personal. And there was great kind of ambivalence. She said, oh God, should I really be doing this? Because I'm doing it to all my writers. I did it for Rob McFarlane and I've done it to others. And I feel really guilty sometimes about doing it. On the other hand, she was a completely brilliant editor and she knew what the market wanted. So it's a difficult thing. Do the prizes kind of exacerbate the problem? Yes, they definitely do. On the other hand, you know, these books for Amy Liptrot recovering from alcoholism, H for Hawk, these stories of sort of personal trauma and salvation and redemption. I mean, they're very kind of sort of mythological tropes, really, in a secular age, and I think they feed this huge appetite. So it's complicated. What I completely agree with Louisa and Jessica is that it would be great to have a wider range of voices. You know, I think it's a great shame that the Wainwright Prize has ended up with a very, you know, it's a prize for nature writing, but it has really, its choices are by and large amazingly conservative. And, you know, even the shortlists, which you can often do really interesting things with a shortlist and bring in new voices and stuff. But I mean, you know, they give the prize to the same people. So, you know, that's a bit of a missed opportunity. But I'm hopeful, like Louisa says, that, you know, just as Black Lives Matter has really blown wide open a whole debate about voices, that we're going to see a much wider diversity of voices. If I was a canny publisher now, I would be looking for really interesting books written by very diverse voices about nature. I mean, that would be a great new way to take the new nature sort of genre on a stage, because it's beginning to look a little bit like, okay, we've been around the courses a few times now, 15 years plus, let's have something new. I think it would be great. So I look forward to seeing Louisa's book on the coastal memoir. Particularly interested, actually, Louisa, because I'm doing a book on coasts as well, so we've got to talk about that one.
And we'll have you back next time to talk about. We'll have a special Nature of Prosperity thing about coastlines, and that's sort of
excellent
well
idea,
with being
Tim.
an island nation.
Excellent idea.
We're still. I'm actually waiting for Rowan to reappear, because he was going to do a sort of summing up at the end, and I don't know whether he had some technical problems earlier and he hasn't reappeared. So I'm just going to keep the conversation going a little bit longer, because it's quite fascinating, and we do have actually another of our contributors on the attendees panel, and that's Jackie Hitt, who wrote a very interesting essay about our fascination with seals. And Jackie, do you want to just pose your question to the panel?
Yeah, my question was about whether there's an opportunity for nature writers to write more about kinship with other species. We're very good at keeping ourselves separate, thinking of ourselves as a part. And I'm just fascinated by what happens when we don't do that, when we try and reach out and make different levels of connection. So yeah, it was about whether this kinship is an opportunity for writers to explore.
That's a really interesting question, particularly because in a sense where nature writing began was kind of in natural history, which was all about classification and division. Madeleine, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, the reason why I was nodding so vigorously, Tim, is I thought you were going to say something about Tarka the otter and Gavin Maxwell, Ring of Bright Water.
No,
you know, I kind of thought actually, in many ways, that is one of the origins of a genre of nature writing, which was all about relationship. My goodness me, what a massive bestseller that became, and fascinating, because actually Gavin Maxwell was not an environmentalist by any stretch. He'd spent the previous decade trying to extract blubber from whales, I think, in some ghastly sort of commercial venture. So I wonder whether film is, film is absolutely terrific. I mean, the big hit at the moment is My Teacher, the Octopus, and which is the most, you're all looking a bit blank, so maybe you haven't come across it. No, so it's on Netflix. It's a huge hit on Netflix. My Teacher, the Octopus. I'll put it in the chat, but it's an extraordinarily moving and touching description of a relationship with an octopus just off the coast of South Africa. So actually, I would say that we have got these stories, both in film and books, about relationships. You know, the cubs, the lions, and kind of Jane Goodall, and so it goes on and on. I think we've got some great kind of giants of that form of literature, actually.
Just Jackie, do you want to just say something, because it just speaks immediately to the point about your essay?
Yeah, I suppose I was thinking more broadly about kinship, that we, rather than with one species, I mean, my essay was about one species, but as you move through every day, you encounter species on multiple levels, whether it be the spider in your sink, be it the pheasant crossing the road, be it the frog in your pond, and it's more about multiple kinship, placing yourself in a relationship with other species in a broader sense, and recognizing the ripple effect, if you like, of your actions on others. You see it a lot in the context of people wilding their gardens, that just the act of doing that changes the relationship that individuals have. Or it could be somebody in an urban environment feeding the birds on their balcony, and it changes the relationship, because, and I describe it as kinship because I think of it as bringing a closer relationship between you and another species. And I'm just fascinated, there don't seem to be, there are lots of books, you're absolutely right, Madeleine, books about people associating with one species and heartwarming relationships, and the octopus film I've seen is amazing. But it's the multiple small little connections that I find even more fascinating. And what does that do about how we care, how we act to be more sustainable, to live more in kinship, I guess.
Thanks, Jackie. Louisa, did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I just think it's a fantastic idea, and it's not something that's really occurred to me to write about. I know there's obviously the big stories about relationships of one species, as Madeleine was saying, and but I suppose there are those moments of connection where, you know, where we do have a connection where we're just, you know, paying attention to a bee on a flower, or, you know, a small insect or an animal. And I think it's just not something I've ever really thought about writing about. Although having said that, I think I did draw on this idea of kinship when I lost my friend and I was writing about birds quite a lot. So I had these connections with birds, and that did come into my writing. So that's the only time I can think I've really done it. But yeah, I think it's a fantastic idea. But I also think really there's a level, us humans can be, it's a level of hypocrisy when it comes to talking about different species, because for example, when everyone went to watch the film Babe back in wherever it was, you know, some people would take their kids out to a McDonald's on the way home, you know, for a burger. So I do think there's a hypocrisy really when it comes to talking about other species, and I think we very much exist in a state of speciesism where we don't, the majority of people don't see animals as being equal to us at all. So perhaps they're not going to be seen as something that's really worth writing. But other than the homeless man who wrote about the cat, I can't remember what that was called. I think there were 2 books about that, actually. I've completely forgotten what it's called, but yeah, it's a man and his cat. But yeah, I think it's a fascinating idea, and I think that moving into that way of writing would certainly help us feel more connected with the environment and with the planet, sort of in a more general way than just somebody who happens to get on well with an octopus or whatever it may be. So yeah, I think it's fantastic. I'd love to read and hear more about that sort of writing. Brilliant idea.
Thanks, Louisa. And just to say, I mean, all of the essays are online, and we will also do a kind of limited print run of them, the ones that we've selected. Jackie's, I thought, was, you know, interesting in the sense that what you picked up in your essay and what you asked about just then was this sense of how we express that connection to another species. And I remember very clearly the sort of, you know, the bottom line, like the punchline of your essay being you came away from that fascination with seals learning a little bit more about human beings than you did maybe about seals, which I thought was a really interesting reflection. I wanted to come back very briefly to Orla and Mahima. I mean, in a sense, both of you looked for that sense of kinship, you know, with more and less success and in different ways across different species, not really attaching to one or another, but very definitely kind of understanding that there was, you know, that there was a diversity of natures, if you like, and some were rosy and fluffy, and some were cruel and terrifying, and some were didn't care much for anything but garbage. Orla, how do you think your writing will go on to affect the way that you work? And on the basis of what you've heard in this discussion, do you think, you know, how would you weigh those two things up in your mind? Your life as a apologist for the term activist, but a sustainability advocate, if you like, and your aspiration as a writer?
Well, I think if I want to think about what's interested me this year, so I wrote the essay last year, but you know, with COVID and everything, it's been about how we live our day-to-day lives, because the one thing the pandemic has shown is that, you know, it affects different people in different ways because we have different daily lives. And, you know, just going back to very simple things like everybody has to get out for a walk pretty much every day, and they're, you know, out and about in their natural surroundings a lot more. I mean, that all of that has been discussed a lot, I think, but I think it's just that idea of what routines do we have, and what makes up the good life. That's what's interesting me at the moment, possibly because there's so much monotony in my day-to-day life this year, but so that daily routine is really interesting me as a writer, if I would call myself that. But yeah, as for sustainability, I think I would go back to the point that I made earlier, which is painting that picture of a future daily routine, a future society, a future economy that is quite different to the one we have now. And yeah, I know the question was about kinship. I suppose that's kinship with nature and different species, but this year certainly has, I mean, that's in my little bio for the essay, is that kind of this year has taught me as as quite a strong introvert that, you know, meeting up with people and human connection is quite lovely. And every time I meet up with my friends this year, it's just joyful. It's just immediately brilliant, and that's new. And so I'll not take that for granted. And I suppose, yeah, that could happen with you know, in similar ways with nature, with other species. Yeah, so that's a collection of what's going through my mind after this conversation and after this year.
Thanks, Ola, and thank you for your contribution. We're really pleased that you submitted something and read it. That was incredibly.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Brave to do that, Mahima.
I know, realize we're almost out of time, so I'll just very briefly say, very much echo what Orla said. You know, we have found ourselves in this great awakening, you know, living in cities, especially. I saw goldfinches out of my window for the first time ever in central London. And I think this is an amazing moment for us to start to draw on that great awakening that we've sort of been through as a society, and for the first time as a global society. You know, there's nothing really that compares. So I think this is probably what I'll take forward into my work and my nature writing is drawing on that awakening.
Thanks, Mahima, and again, thank you for your contribution and for reading to us today. I wanted to come back to Kate and Ian. Kate, unfortunately, is just dipped off the call, but Ian, maybe just a closing reflection from you on just listening to the panelists, listening to the essayists, thinking about the conversation, what we set in motion a couple of years ago. And what we've achieved in that process, and the body of work which didn't exist before, is from a diverse range of authors, does address the question of nature writing and cares about sustainability. What are your closing thoughts on that?
Well, I just want to thank everyone who's taken part today, to our authors and all the panel, because I think this conversation that we've had is really rich, and it underlines, I think, the value of the project which we started off, which I think needs to be seen as a starting point rather than any kind of conclusion. I think it's been a really rich discussion, and the points I want to pick up are about how, as well as thinking about nature, we should also be thinking about place and relationship, and about the idea of paying attention, intimate attention to nature as a bridge to care. I thought that was a great line from Jessica. And it connects to what Madeleine was talking about, the idea of an ethic of care, humility. And I think all of these strands weave together to tell a story about responsibility as something which nature writing, done really well, can start enhancing in us. I'm still struggling with the big question that you've posed, Tim, which is how much further we go with pushing new nature writing as a contribution to the small p politics of sustainable transformation. And I suppose one way of framing that is to say, how are we going to connect this discussion to the discussion we had this morning with Rowan and with Graham about reimagining democracy, reimagining our politics in the light of responsibilities to future generations. We can reframe that and say, what about our responsibilities, not just to future generations, but also to our neighbours, the more than human neighbours that we share our places with. And that was something that came through nicely in the discussion on kinship. And maybe that's, I'm probably setting up Rowan here to talk about love of neighbour, but I think that idea of thinking of the more than human neighbours, as well as our neighbours in time, is potentially a fruitful way of linking up this discussion with the discussion that we had this morning about rethinking democracy. But thank you to everyone.
Thank you, Ian.
Really rich.
Yes, thank you very much for that. I mean, I'm glad that you made that connection, because it was a sort of a game of two halves, as they say in the trade. And this morning was very much talking about future generations, and this afternoon was very much talking about other species. And so Ian's point there, that actually in the same way that we need to learn to think, feel kinship for other species, perhaps we also need to learn kinship for future generations and to figure out how to govern for those generations. And perhaps there is, in fact, an element within writing, within nature writing, within any kind of writing, that is about the exploration of those two most important relationships of all, in a sense. Ian said he was going to be setting up Rowan for a final reflection, but unfortunately, and I apologize for this, I'm not quite sure what's happened, we have lost Rowan. He was experiencing some technical difficulties this morning, but that has allowed us to go a little bit further with the conversation, and which I, again, echoing Ian, I found absolutely fascinating. It was a real joy to listen to everybody, and apologies for posing almost impossible questions to answer about the nature of writing and the responsibility of writers. It does seem to me that, and then something that I kind of reflected on through the collection as a whole, not any individual essay, but the collection of as a whole of people who were not published, experienced professional writers, engaging with something, that a challenge that we had set them, an almost impossible challenge in some ways, because we were asking them to talk about nature, but also to think about nature in an activist way, to use writing as a vehicle for activism, to think about activism for the common good, and to do all that in a way that was totally inclusive and diverse. And actually, you know, I mean, one interesting thing was that there wasn't a single lone enraptured male in our collection. There was a quite diverse range of voices. In that sense, I think we can be quite successful. And the question that I struggled with a little bit looking at the collection was, do we see here activism in a traditional sense, in a kind of sense of a call to arms, if you like, or a revolution, or a challenge to capitalism? And there were intimations of that in some of the essays, but they didn't, in that very simplistic way, I think, represent an activism for the common good. And yet it seemed to me, looking at the whole, this kind of almost kaleidoscopic brilliance of the essays as a whole, ordinary people writing about that relationship to nature. It put me in mind, actually, of one of what I would call one of the very, very earliest nature writers, which was a poet called Christopher Smart, who was writing back in the middle of the 18th century. And he wrote two extraordinary poems from the depths of an asylum. He was locked up for praying too fervently in public after a slightly dodgy relationship with alcohol, and he went from being one of the most celebrated people in London to being incarcerated in a prison. And from that prison place, he wrote what I think are two nature poems. And one is this, an absolutely chaotic, almost like a mimicry of the Book of Psalms, full of references to nature, to God, to divinity, to our lives, to historical characters. It reads like the memoirs of a madman, and sort of makes you think, well, they were right to put him in a prison. But then out of that bedrock, he wrote one of the most elegiac poems called A Song to David, in which he sets out what is, I think, something quite extraordinary, which is the idea that it is through words and through language that we connect ourselves with the natural world. And in some sense, we both build and rebuild the natural world through language, through words themselves, through our relationship with words. And that was what I began to see through this kind of kaleidoscope of essays from very inexperienced writers, and on many cases, bringing in trauma, bringing in their relationship to the world, bringing in their perspectives on the nature they saw around us, and thinking through nature, talking through nature, writing through nature. One of the essayists, I think, captured that quite brilliantly for me was Joanna Garrard, and she was speaking from the perspective of an autist, and the point about autist, as she reminded us through the New Zealand, the Maori word for autism, is that it's about living in your own time. And that slowness of time and the different scales of time that she talked about through her relationship with nature, it seemed to me, were echoed across the pieces, that what people had begun to do in such a, as I say, a charismatic, embedded and often quite emotional way, bringing in their own vulnerabilities, was exactly to create that building and rebuilding of our human world through the lessons that nature brings to us. And that, it seemed to me, was no better affidavit for the success of what Ian and Kate kicked off a couple of years ago, and no better reflection of the extraordinary dedication that the writers themselves brought to that exercises, the judges brought to that exercises, and the discussion this afternoon has brought to it as well. So I'm really grateful to Ian and Kate for making that happen, and to all of the authors for commenting, particularly, of course, Mahima and Orlaith for braving the reading of your own material on the internet. That was fantastic. And to our judges, to Louisa, to Jessica, to Madeleine. I can't possibly go without thanking those who you have not seen this afternoon, and whose success in this afternoon is the fact that you haven't seen them, the ones who kind of make webinars and YouTube work. And in particular, of course, to Catherine Hunt and to Linda Gessner for making that such a seamless day of absolutely fascinating discussions. As I mentioned before, the essays themselves are now online, and we will put all of the, with your permission, we will put all of the proceedings and the discussion online as well, both from this afternoon's session and from this morning's session. And it remains really only for me to wish you all well. I think tomorrow, watch this space in relation to the Hilary Weston Award in which Jessica is up for, and the best of wishes to all of your work, whether that is as a sustainability advocate, as an activist, as an academic, as a journalist, as a writer, as a nature writer, as an artist, or as a human being. I wish you all well. That was The Nature of Prosperity. Thank you all for attending. Bye.